and welcome to this FMB webinar on Tuesday, the 1st of December. Who can believe it's December already? Thank you for joining us. And this is webinar number 4 in our series on contracts. And again, we have Sarah Fox, the 500-word lawyer, with us to talk about what your client really, really wants and how to reflect that in their contracts. So I know that some members have joined us for all of these contracts webinars. I think that means that you're finding the content really useful. And I know that just as many members are watching the recordings of the webinars via the website online afterwards. So we're going to be running more of those in the new year, dates yet to be confirmed. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sarah to start today's webinar. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. And one of the things that we are going to be doing in the new year, we've got some really good content on the webinars. We will be looking at things like change management, which I know is a big issue at the moment in terms of the sort of issues that we've seen in the pandemic. So hopefully you can now see my screen. So yeah. In the sessions that we've done so far, we've covered a number of different things. Excuse me, I'm just zipping in the wrong direction because we've been trying to make sure that we can talk about simple contracts. So in the first session, we looked at why you should create simple contracts. And that was largely to create confidence. And a lot of the people at the webinar said that that was one of the real things that they got out of a simpler contract, that they're confident that they could use it with their clients. A simple contract can help safeguard your business by being really clear what the parties' obligations are and can help you avoid disputes because both of you can understand it, you can follow it, and you can both know exactly what you have to do. Then in session 2, we started looking at the bare minimum that you could get away with. Now, I'm not suggesting the bare minimum is what you should be including in your contracts as only in your contracts, but this is things that you absolutely have to get right if you're going to have a contract in legal terms under English Welsh law, because we need a certain amount of certainty to be sure that the parties and the works are clear to both people involved in the project. And if we don't have clarity on that, well, we may not actually have a contract. And that's a really difficult place to be. And we know that sort of 30% of contracts in the UK construction industry aren't signed before the works start. We also know about 3% aren't signed until the works are finished. I think it's really important that we understand that contracts actually should help you do business. So it's important that although they might be legal, they might be paperwork, but they might not be the core of what you do, they're still a very important part of running a professional master builder business. And then the last session, we looked at getting the client to understand when the works will be done, when they will be started, when they will finish, how the completion date can change, and also how much they're going to have to pay. We know that one of the major causes of friction and disputes on construction projects globally, however big they are, is to do with how much money should be transferring between the client and the contractor for the works that have actually been done on site. So all these things are important, and they're all part of effectively clarifying the client's understanding. Because your contracts really do need to demonstrate that you understand what your client wants, what her needs are, that you've demonstrated that you're competent and trustworthy, that you've got processes in place to help deal with the unexpected, and to help your client understand what she can expect when you work together. Your client may never have been involved in a construction project before, and she'll have lots of myths and legends coming from television programs that she's seen. And it's really important that we can try and draw clients in using our contracts to kind of explain the process a little bit more, demystify what construction really means. Your contract needs to be robust and effective, one that both of you can read, understand, and use. So we looked in the last few sessions at the bare minimum. So I said in session 2, we looked at people, works, goods and services, the who and the what. And then in session 3, we looked at price, payment mechanisms, complying with the Construction Acts and the Consumer Rights Act. And we also looked at timescales and programme. And one of the things we introduced in the new FMB suite was a indicative timeline to explain to clients that although there is a completion date written into their contract, that completion date can change for all sorts of reasons. Because we wanted to manage expectations, mean that there was fewer surprises for those people who get kind of viscerally excited about a particular completion date before all the information is known. Because until you start work on a site, until you start digging foundations and working with clients, it's very difficult to be a guarantee a completion date. But some clients get quite bound into the promises that are made very early on. So in this session, what we're going to look at is quality and performance, because defects on projects, as you will know if you read the papers, are a major cause of client unhappiness with the completed project. They're also a major cause of long-term and costly construction disputes. And we need to look at the client's why. Why are they doing this project in the first place? Because if you've done hundreds and hundreds of these sort of projects before, you may be missing what's unique about this one for this client. And then we're not going to look at methods of working until the new year. So we need to think about what you're going to try and achieve. So Hayley, could you launch the first poll, please? So it'd be interesting to find out what you think are some of the biggest causes of problems on your projects. So we don't have a particularly large live audience today. So it's interesting, though, that all of the people who did vote looked at the cost of the works increasing. It is a major cause of friction on projects, which is why we dealt with it last week. So if you didn't, or last session, so if you didn't see session 3, please go back and have a look at session 3, because it will help you to try and deal with some of the friction issues. So let's look about performance, and we're going to look at quality standards in construction projects. So this home, which we've come across on several occasions during the course of this, is a home costing nearly £10 million. Just one of these 3 cost about £10 million. But on completion, there was a list of snagging items which went on for pages. There were hundreds of ways that the client was unhappy with the completed project. But this is not maybe the sort of project you get involved in, but we also know other famous projects that are defective. So the Leaning Tower of Pisa took 200 years, 199 years to construction, started leaning before phase 1 was complete. So should it have been leaning? Was it in fact defective? Because it's a bell tower, it's still capable of being used as a bell tower. So the question always comes back to, what does the client want? What does it want it to do? Does it want it to be aesthetically pleasing and upright, or does it want it to ring bells, to bring people to church? This is another example of a potentially defective project. And this actually achieved practical completion before they realised it was wobbling. So this is a Millennium Bridge in London, which was certified as complete under the terms of the contract, and then tested in a sponsored walk, and it wobbled. It took 18 months to rectify the wobble to the satisfaction of the client. And then this is a twisted spire. It's not the one in Chesterfield, it's in Virchin in France, but knowing whether or not it's defective is really important to know what the actual scope of the work said. Because one of the things that they found, and there's quite a lot of twisted spires in France, is that some of them twisted by accident, or poor design, you might call it. But some of them were designed to look twisted because the churches with twisted spires got more money and more tourists. So some were specifically designed to look twisted, because how would anyone tell later? So understanding what's defective means we need to know what the contract asked the project to do. What was it meant to look like? Was it meant to wobble? Was it meant to twist? Was it meant to lean? Before we can say whether or not it meets the terms of the contract. So we've got a number of different quality standards that we need to cover, and there are generally layers of these. There's kind of 2 different types of quality standards so that we can genuinely divide the quality standards into. We've got works and services, and we've got goods and materials. Now, your contract needs to describe or refer to a document which describes on its behalf, like a specification, the functional and aesthetic requirements of the works when finished, so how beautiful it looks, but also what it's meant to do. A specification for any goods and materials, like any particular functional requirements, say for air conditioning or fire safety. Any tests or inspections that any works need to pass. So the fact that you've got a light switch in a room is no good if when you click it, nothing happens. And also any standards for design, good workmanship and supervision. So this is an example out of the FMB contract, and it talks about reasonable skill and care. And that's a works and services standard. It's just kind of the bare minimum you'd expect. Reasonable skill and care means average competence. So are you as competent as the average building contractor? And if you meet that requirement, then that's good enough. And that's called an input standard because it's about how much expertise you add into the project, not necessarily what pops out the other side. So we also talk about the fact that you have to comply with building regulations. Well, you do, and all legal requirements. So those things are kind of the bare minimum that your client expects. So they don't really add anything to the discussion. When it comes to goods and materials, it's a slightly different type of standard. Generally speaking, when we're talking about goods and materials, we're talking about an output standard. So this is references to things like fit for their normal purposes. So English law prescribes various implied terms such as satisfactory quality, fit for normal purposes, and they also should be as described in the documents. So that's what we expect. And these are very high standards in terms of what you could do. You can't really get rid of them because if you take these out, that's what English law would apply in any event. So that if you're in a contract which is an English law or Welsh law contract, then these would be implied even if you took these clauses out by various bits of legislation. So clients can, however, want specific goods and materials that you might have to install, or they might want specific performances. And that's where it starts to get a bit difficult because a specific performance written into the contract in one of the documents, for example, that's attached to the contract, can imply a fitness for purpose obligation. Now, fitness for purpose obligations generally make contractors a little uneasy because it's difficult to insure for fitness for purpose, which means if it doesn't do what the client asked, they might be liable to rectify it without having any compensation from their insurance. So fitness for purpose is quite a kind of a wording which has very specific meaning and relates generally to goods and materials. So goods and materials really should be fit for their purpose because let's face it, nobody wants to buy a computer, for example, that you can't actually use as a computer. So that's fine. The difficulty we've seen in quite a lot of cases and where fitness for purpose has got a bad reputation is when we're talking about the whole project. So the whole project you're doing for the client should be fit for its purpose. Well, for any project, it will have a number of different purposes. So anything that you do could be used for other purposes. So you might build a client a porch, but they might actually then start using it as a home office, maybe when it's got a pandemic, or they might start using it as a fitness suite, or they might want to do other things with it. So fitness for purpose should be restricted to goods and materials. It's a much easier measure. But why should you bother writing what the quality standards are? Well, it's really important that if you don't write it into the contract, both in the contract conditions and in the works documents, the specification, the drawings that describe the work, then you end up on implied terms. Now, we've talked about the fact that reasonable skill and care, satisfactory quality, fitness for reasonable purposes would be the implied terms. And it may be the case that you still have to meet the same standard, but any term which is implied into a contract is one that the clients probably don't know about. Now, one of the reasons we wanted to write them into the contract is because we want the clients to understand exactly what you're trying to achieve on their behalf, so they can be clear what your obligations are. Because there's nothing worse than a client believing you're trying to achieve A, when in fact the contract says you're achieving B, because that's where the misunderstandings lie. So we've said that the implied terms would talk about things like satisfactory quality, reasonably fit for intended purposes, and the use of reasonable skill and care. However, reasonable, what counts as reasonable? Generally speaking, in order to work that out, you need expert opinion or expert advice. That's not a very easy standard when you think you've used reasonable skill and care and the client disagrees with you. So to the extent that you can be more objective about what they're trying to achieve, that's better. And the other thing is, if you're working with a consumer, then under the Consumer Rights Act 2015, the client is entitled to rely on any promises that you have given in relation to your skills, your expertise, the sort of projects you've done in the past, that it will be proper luxury, or whatever words you've used when you've been selling your business. They're entitled to rely on that. So be careful about over-promising. It's really important that you under-promise and over-deliver rather than over-promise and under-deliver. And although not all of your projects may have a contract administrator on, somebody independent, you sometimes see contracts stating that it's to the satisfaction of a particular person, a contract administrator, project manager, or an architect. That's an okay standard if you can't describe it in the specification and you trust that contract administrator to be objective. And the client also has to trust the contract administrator is objective. So we've seen this project before, and this project was to do with a basement conversion, which went horribly wrong. And the client's understanding of quality, well, it clearly wasn't this. So they didn't probably explain exactly the sort of quality they expected from their basement conversion, but they certainly didn't expect the rest of the house to fall down around their ears. So quality is important, because actually the competence that the contractor claimed to have in relation to doing basement works was not the competence they actually had when it came to doing basement works. So describing your competence in a way which gives your client confidence is really important, so that they can establish whether or not you should be doing this job in the first place. Hayley, if you could launch poll 2, please. Well, I'm really pleased to hear that you do ask your clients why they're doing a project, because their why is the only reason they're handing over their cold hard cash. Recently, we had our double glazing replaced with triple glazing. I mean, partly that was because the double glazing was defective. It had been around, it had missed it up. But actually, what we really wanted them to do was to make sure not only that they installed the double glazing, but they made sure that everything that could be made warm and watertight and to the best, eco standards was done, rather than they just kind of flung them in a bit lackadaisical or without really thinking about why we're doing this project. Because it wasn't about aesthetic for us. The reason to choose triple glazing is to get a better warmth in your home, to improve your U value. So anything they did which undermined that by creating thermal bridges would have been a mistake. But they didn't ask, and it was really interesting. They kind of made an assumption that that's what we wanted because that's what everyone wants, sort of thing. And it would have been nice to have been asked and been listened to. On top of working out what quality means for our clients, we also need to work out what happens if we don't deliver the quality that the client wants. And this is a defects period, and you would see these in all the normal contracts, and it's really important. It's important to remember that under the Consumer Rights Act, then the Consumer Rights Act says that if you provide goods or services which don't meet the client's requirements or don't meet the contract, then they can ask you to re-perform those services or works if necessary, or they can ask for refunds or even have a right to reject. So this is on top of their rights under the Consumer Rights Act. And this would be, the normal process is to have a defects period. And it's set at 6 months in the FMB contracts. It's very clear what you're not responsible for in terms of defects, anything that they've provided, works that are done by anyone else, or design that's been supplied by them. So meeting the terms of the contract, if your contract is not clear, then it's very difficult to define under 15.1 whether or not the work does meet the terms of the contract. So it's really important that your contracts clarify what the quality standards are, and so that clarify them in a way that a client can say, yes, that definitely meets what the contract says you'll do. And there have been lots of cases of people having quite vague terms about what they want to achieve, like highest quality or luxury, and that's open to interpretation. If you can possibly clarify the standard of works to a way which isn't open to interpretation, that's the best thing that you can do, because then it's much clearer what isn't a defect. So if you think about the Tower of Pisa, the fact that it's leaning, is it really a defect? It might not have been intended to be upright, lean at all, but if you can still ring the bell, if that's all they really wanted it for, then aesthetically it's a little wonky, but actually it's much more famous because it leans, and they got loads more money because it leans. So they might be happy if they can still ring the bell. So understanding what the requirements are is really important for when you write the contract. So in terms of aims, what's a client's why? It's really important to get under the skin of a client. A client loves it if you repeat back to them why they got you involved in the first place. So it's very easy to pigeonhole work and projects into, oh, that they just want one of those. We've done one of those recently. But avoiding assumptions is really important, because then you can really be sure that you're doing exactly what the client wants, not what you think they want. So it's really important to ask the right questions. So one of the things you need to ask is about time, cost, and quality. We looked at in previous sections and just earlier today, but also the really client-specific needs. What's different about this client, this project, this site? What do they really want? And then also, how are you going to work together? How will you trust each other? Because working together is an aim of all construction projects, because they can't go and live in a cave for 6 months while you build their project and not have any communication and come back and find it's exactly what they wanted. That's not how the project works. So all construction projects require a to and fro. And this requires you to ask really good questions. So asking better questions involves things like, what does your client really want to achieve? What does success look like? Do they want it what you might call a bling mansion, or do they want kind of an eco-friendly extension? Do they want it for work or leisure or just for fun? Do they want it to show off, or do they want it to be quite quiet? Which of the project aims are the most important? Is it more important that it's finished on time, on budget, to the right quality? And that will very much depend from client to client. Or is there something else, like meeting ecological standards? And how will the works that you're doing help your client to achieve their goals and solve their problems? It could be that they don't have enough space, or it could be that they want to make more use of a particular part of their home. So asking those questions really helps you to avoid misunderstandings later on. So success very much depends on a client. If you don't state in your contract what the client wants to achieve, then it's very difficult to say later that you did what they asked. You will still have enough certainty if you don't state what the client wants to achieve, but you kind of never know whether you're part of a successful project or one which didn't quite hit the mark. And also, if you don't know what a key aim is, whether it's time, cost, quality, or something else, then it's much harder for them to make decisions when changes happen on site. So really important to find out what success means for this client. So this is from the FMB short form and makes reference to what the client's requirements are, and basically says, please, if we haven't understood properly, let us know now so that we can get it right. So here's an example of a project that we've seen before in a previous session, and this was to do with the construction of a swimming pool, which was intended to be 7'6" deep. And when it was finally completed, it actually only ended up as just over 6 foot. And the client was very upset because he specifically wanted to be able to dive into this pool. Now, in order to dive into a pool, you don't need to make it long. You don't need to make it mosaic tiled. You don't even need curvy steps. You just need it to be deep. And if that was a client's key objective for this pool, then the contractor should have known about it and should have gone hell for leather to make sure that they actually complied with that. So there was a big debate about whether or not he could even get this rebuilt because he didn't feel it was safe, even though expert evidence said that it was as safe to dive into a pool that's 6 foot deep as one that was 7'6". He wasn't happy with this pool. Now, to me, looks like an absolutely fabulous pool should we ever get decent weather. And I imagine in lockdown, it would have been a fabulous bonus to have during the heat wave we had back in May and June. But the client was still unhappy. So it might be a fabulous pool to someone else, but if it doesn't quite hit the mark, then you could end up in a dispute. This dispute went all the way to the House of Lords, or what's now called the Supreme Court, cost hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of legal fees, all over not really understanding what the client wants, so not giving them what they needed. So once you've kind of developed the client-specific things, you also need to think about how you create trust. There is no legal requirement for you to trust your client, and there's no legal requirement for your client to trust you. But it does make the whole process easier if there's trust between the parties. Over the time I've reviewed clients and written client contracts and looked at projects, I've seen far too many contracts drafted on the basis of a small percentage of clients who will muck you about in some way, shape or form, or who are difficult to deal with. It could be that they don't let you onto site, they always pay late, they never provide instructions, they don't like approving things, they change their mind, they're shilly-shally, they complain bitterly over the slightest dust in their coffee. They just make your working life unpleasant. So there will be a small proportion of those that you meet in carrying out any project or doing any business. But it's much better to kind of set a contract based on good expectations, but being realistic enough to know that that's not necessarily going to solve your problem if you come across a real grumpy person, a Victor Meldrew of clients, shall we say. Now, interestingly enough, under English and Welsh law, there is an implied obligation on the parties to a construction project, however many parties there are. This is from small projects in somebody's home up to big corporate multi-layered projects, including HS2 and all those sorts of projects. There's an implied obligation on all those parties to cooperate with each other. And cooperation means things like giving access, paying money, providing information, approvals and instructions, not getting in each other's way. So if you've said that you're going to leave the house so that the building work can continue, then that's leaving the house so the building work can continue. And whenever providing information, providing honest, truthful information. So not making it up, not overinflating your invoices, but also not being unclear about what might be buried under your patio. So trust is really useful when it comes to projects, and simple contracts do tend to engender better trust because people can read them, they can check them, they can review them, they can understand them. So they don't think about small print in the way that lots of people talk about. They don't think about nasties in the contract like you often heard talked about. So building trust could be about talking about what takes priority in terms of time, cost, quality or other. What's unique about this project? Building trust helps to avoid misunderstandings, and misunderstandings can lead inevitably to disputes. When you've got client-specific terms, they must be expressly written into the contract, because we've dealt with the typical trio in the FMB suite, but we can't deal with everything that clients want. And some clients, let's face it, have quite unique needs. As I've said, there is an implied obligation on all parties to the project to cooperate. Clients don't tend to know this, so they tend to believe that it's all your obligation, but it is a two-way street very much when you're dealing with a construction project. So here's an example of a project which was completed in 2016, and this has made the papers repeatedly. This was a couple who bought a house in Norwich for about £350,000, but went to the papers because they've now had to move out of this home 3 times in order to have various different defects rectified by the house builders. And you can imagine that by the time they've moved out the second time, trust is pretty low. But by the time they've had to move out 3 times into what should have been a brand new luxury dream home for this couple, their trust is now at an all-time low. Now, it would be fair to say that if this was a renovation work, they could in fact have just turned around to the contractors and said, that's it, we don't want you back on site anymore. You've tried all you can to rectify defects. And this couple could decide at some point that they're going to just get someone else in to finish this job properly and sue the home builders for it. But the big problem with this is not just the little tiny number of defects, and some of them were big, some of them were kind of small around the edges, but the fact that they've now created a bad reputation for this home builder. And it was splashed across the BBC, the national press. It started as a little local story, but has gone much bigger. And defects can do that because the problem is they wanted to live in this house, perfect or not perfect, for the rest of their lives. So bad quality will last however long they live in this house. It will always be associated with the bad quality that they thought they got when they first moved in. So the problem with quality standards and defects is that bad quality lasts the lifetime of the project. And that's much worse than time and cost issues, because they can get resolved. They can get resolved and you can get over it and you can move on. But bad quality when it comes to projects lasts much longer in the client's mind, and they'll talk about it for much longer. So that's why quality, although we discussed at the beginning that it wasn't one of the most important causes of problems, it actually has a much longer lasting impact. And it's more likely to hit the papers because poor quality, defects, niggling, not being able to resolve complaints is more likely to be newsworthy than the fact it costs slightly more than they were expecting. So Hayley, could you just launch the last poll, please? So before this, I'm not quite sure how much you thought about the role of trust and fair terms in contracts, but it'd be interesting to find out how important you actually think that is. Well, it's really interesting to see, because I know that one of the things that publishers of standard forms have said is that actually there isn't enough trust in the UK construction industry. And therefore, we have to have much more complicated contracts to deal with the lack of trust. And that seems to me to be the chicken and egg argument all over again. Do we have more trust because we have simple contracts? Or do we use simple contracts to create more trust? Because the idea that more complex contracts helps to replace trust is kind of an unusual one, and it seems to me to be the wrong way to attack it. But that's all I wanted to say about quality and trust. So do we have any questions?
Okay, I can't see any questions in the Q&A box at the moment, Sarah, but I've got a question for you, because I know that in the FMB's Dispute Resolution Service, we always say, and it says on the application form that consumers have to complete to use the service, that the first option should be to have the contractor back to complete the work that the client isn't happy with. But sometimes consumers will say, well, I've lost trust in that builder. I want to get somebody else in. I'm going to take them to court to recoup the money, and I want a new contractor to come and finish the project. And partly, I think they're thinking that the grass is going to be greener on the other side of the hill with this fresh new building contractor, although it's often quite difficult for them to find another builder who will come and take on that almost complete project. But at what point do the courts sort of differentiate between when is it reasonable to have lost trust in your builder and when is it just you not fulfilling your obligation to act reasonably and fulfill your side of the contract? It's difficult to know, isn't it, where that would be.
And it's a really important part of English contract law, is that if you're bringing a claim, you have what's called a duty to mitigate. So essentially, you have to act reasonably. If somebody has caused you loss or hasn't followed their contract, and let's face it, a defect is where you've not complied with the terms of the contract to the letter. So they do have a legitimate complaint. The purpose of a defects remedy is to avoid going to court. So that's one of the things to say to people is like, well, if you get someone else in, you're really going to have to go to court because you're going to have to prove that there was a defect, that it was reasonable to get someone else in. And the courts may not agree. There have been cases where clients have not given a contractor an option to come back at all. They've just said, no, don't want you anymore. You're not interested. And they said, well, that's not reasonable. You have to give them at least one opportunity to come back. If they then don't fix it, then you may be, but not necessarily within your rights to get someone else in then. But you may need to give them two chances. And if they still haven't sorted it out, it will depend on how urgent and how emergency that issue is. Because obviously, if somebody says we can come back, we'll come back for 3 months, it's the middle of winter and it's a central heating, then you'd be within your rights to go and get heating, because things like heating, fresh water are kind of core to being able to use the house. But generally speaking, the courts won't be sympathetic if you just up sticks and say, don't want them anymore, don't like them, got bored with them, or got fed up, because you've got a contract and their contract allows them to come back to fix those defects for those 6 months. You would have to prove that they've been incompetent in order to say, we don't want you back anymore. And also, why would somebody want to take that job on? Because they're then potentially, involved in a tiny little sliver of a project, but they could have longer lasting liability, which is probably why a lot of contractors don't want to take on somebody else's
99.9% finished project.
Yeah.
So the courts really have been clear. There was a case a few years ago now where a company had done a really terrible job, not just in completing the project on time and on budget, but there were quality issues were legion. There was water seeping through the new home. So really serious, not just a few cracks of plaster and a door hanging off. These were really serious defects. And they'd worked with them for nearly 6 months to try and get them to fix. And eventually they lost it. And they just said, don't come back. And the court said, you're right. You're within your rights now to say, we don't want you back on site because you've tried repeatedly to fix this. You've made things worse, not better. They're fine. They're allowed to step back and say, enough.
Okay. So Isabella has asked a question. What if they address only part of the issue and didn't address the rest of the remaining issues? And I assume she means sort of defect in the project. How much time do they have to respond to the email addressing their response?
So in terms of how long you have to make a defect good, it will depend on the severity of the defect. So, it will depend on how urgent it is. So minor aesthetic issues, you get a reasonable time to sort them out. Reasonable time, that's very subjective. If it's something like an electricity supply, a water supply, central heating, that sort of thing, you may have to go and sort it out quite quickly. But the first thing you need to sort out with your client, and I think this is what the question is getting at, is it a defect? And in whose opinion is it a defect? So it's not always easy with some of the defects to say it's a clear yes or no. Does it meet the specification? Does it meet the scope of works? Generally speaking, by the time you're listing defects in emails, you may have fallen out with each other. One of the ways around that is to kind of go to a mediation service and try and agree what the list is. Or even if you just agree that you'll pay a surveyor to come round and work out what the defects are and kind of take a reasonable objective approach. Because generally speaking, clients are not necessarily the most objective when it comes to their own projects. They kind of fall in love with them. They get rather viscerally and emotionally involved with them. So sometimes taking a step back and just working out what is and isn't a defect. Clients often use defects as an excuse not to pay anything, which obviously isn't actually what the contract says about how they should pay. And just any defects can cause major friction at the bit of the project when you really want it to be going well, so that they will, finish the project, pay you, talk about you well. So is that the question? So if they've only addressed part of it, you need to, the parties need to make sure that they have some sort of timescale. So if they say, I've got these 4 defects and you go and fix 2 of them, there should be a follow-up email between the 2 parties, ideally sent by the contractor to say, we've done these 2, we'll be back by, you don't have to give a specific date that you'll be back, but back in the next 2 weeks to fix the next 2 at a time that's convenient to you. And it always has to be convenient to the client, because this is your way as a builder of trying to avoid going to court. So you have to be pretty proactive and pretty helpful to the client at this point. Otherwise, they're just going to get fed up and chuck you off site maybe, or not pay you. So you don't have to respond immediately unless it's something that you think, if it was in your house, you'd want fixing immediately. But my answer is, if you send an email and you want immediate response, that should have been a telephone call, because telephones are for dealing with urgent matters. Emails are for dealing with things that you need a record of and you need a reply in a couple of days.
Okay. Well, Isabella's given some more detail on the nature of that dispute, but I think you've already answered what the next steps would be in terms of perhaps getting a surveyor involved. Just said thank you for that answer, so that's fine. So I think I can't see any more questions in the Q&A box for today. As you said, we had a small audience today, so I guess that means fewer questions. So you're getting off lightly today, Sarah, with the Q&A session. So I think I'll just wrap up there for today and just say thank you to everybody who's attended, and thank you for Sarah for some useful content today, as always. And we will be running 4 more webinars on contracts in the new year. We haven't agreed dates yet, but you'll get all the information about that via email. I do just want to flag up one webinar on a different topic that might be of interest, which is going to be on the 5th of January. which is all about how to prepare an award-winning entry, because FMB's launched the Master Builder Awards for this year, which closes on the 15th of January. And we've got last year's winner as well as an industry expert speaker talking about what the judges will be looking for in an award-winning project. And we know that the local publicity that can be generated by winning a Master Builder Award is worth its weight in gold in terms of the clients that then come flocking to you for their profitable and fantastic building projects. So that's one worth looking out for. There will still be 10 days when the awards are open from the 5th of January to the 15th if you're interested in doing that. But we'll close there for today. Thanks again to Sarah and to you for attending. And for the first time this year, I can say have a good Christmas as well. So thank you very much and goodbye.
Yes, I hope all your members have a very happy Christmas period.
Yeah, a very busy one, I think, Sarah, for some
Yes.
of them. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.